Thanks. So here's the title of my talk, The Person-Centred Approach, the Human Growth Movement and Psychedelics. That could in fact be reversed. It could be psychedelics, the human growth movement, and the person-centred approach. They're very interlinked. In 2025, interest in the use of psychedelics as a therapy for trauma and addiction is on the ascendant. Many counsellors and psychologists may be discovering their clients are seeking to explore using psychedelics, mushrooms, MDMA, and other associated substances in order to relieve them from medication prescribed by their GP. In this seminar, I wish to offer some historical context to what is happening now. How is LSD connected to the human growth movement, which was flourishing in the 60s and 70s? Why were people using LSD after it had been made illegal? Who was manufacturing it, and what was their motivation? Were they just drug dealers, or was there a more revolutionary intent behind their activity? This is a Winnebago saying, which is also actually the Ho-Chunk Nation. That's the name they now own, because it's their original name. Winnebago was given by Europeans, which is often the case. Ho-Chunk Nation, people of the big voice. Holy Mother Earth, the trees, and all nature are witnesses of your thoughts and deeds. This statement matters to me greatly, and it underpins the essence of this presentation. I was inspired in London when I went to see Anne Baring, who's a Jungian analyst, in 2001. And part of the quote from her presentation was, "It was the shaman who transmitted the messages received from an unseen world. Today, a visionary may be defined as someone who suffers from delusions or hallucinatory images or voices, who is at worst psychotic, at best emotionally unstable." In 1373, Julian of Norwich experienced her divine shewings, which she recorded and completed writing in 1393. Julian was an essential part of my studies and experiencing at the University of East Anglia, where I trained to be a person-centred counsellor. One of the earliest women writers, she was an anchorite. For those of you that don't know, an anchorite was a wealthy woman who was able to afford to fund herself to be built into the corner of a church. There was no exit. You had your own washing area and things. People would bring you food. People of Norwich would visit her at the window of her cell, and she would receive their struggles and pray for or with them whilst in her isolated living conditions. She experienced what she describes as divine shewings, and many scholars consider her account of her mystical experience to be evidence of her depth of understanding of the meaning of the message of Christianity. Then, jumping forward a few centuries, we have Shakespeare. Frequently, he refers to mystical experiences, out-of-body experiences, encounters with sprites and angelic forces. "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometime voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then, in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches, ready to drop upon me, that, when I waked, I cried to dream again." Moving forward again, William Blake. Blake was a visionary. He could see the fundamental issues facing all of nature and the human race as the industrialisation of everything was overtaking all of existence. In 2002, I attended the symposium at La Jolla, where Carl Rogers' 100th year of birth was celebrated. The School of American Indian Studies was a big part of the celebration. The use of the circle and the tradition of the talking stick resonate greatly with the values and principles of the person-centred approach. I witnessed a true sense of an alignment between the person-centred approach and Native American traditions. I experienced the shared wish to not alter or interfere, to give time, space and praise, to trust the process and a connection into a process of love, creating a presence to life and valuing that as it is, holding the space, loving the space and trusting all will be well. All these aspects I have known both in the Native American approach and in the person-centred approach. Neither hold ownership of these things, and each has their imperfect moments and aspects, and those imperfections remain teachers to me. Black Elk was one of the first people to actually articulate and put into print his experiences and memories of his own culture of the Oglala Lakota people. He was a Hayoka, which is similar to, if I guess we could call shaman in Western understanding. In 1930, he said, "You've noticed that everything an Indian does is in a circle, and that is because the power of the world always works in circles, and everything tries to be round. The sky is round, and I've heard the earth is round like a ball, and so are all the stars. The wind in its great power whirls. Birds make their nests in circles, for theirs is the same religion as ours." So, in 1943, Albert Hofmann has the first recorded scientifically created psychedelic experience. LSD wasn't always illegal. It was a sanctioned focus for research from the early 1940s, when Hofmann first came across it by accident in his laboratory, when he was looking for ways, or various scientists were looking for ways, during the Second World War, of stemming blood flow from soldiers, obviously a very important thing at the time. And on a parallel route, bizarrely, for women in childbirth to stop them from hemorrhaging. So on the one hand, it was trying to stop soldiers from dying, and on the other hand, it was trying to enable more women to survive the unpredictable process of giving birth. Here is a quote from Richard Kemp, who I'll talk about a bit more later on. Around about the time of the Second World War, Albert Hofmann was working in the laboratory of Sandoz in Basel in Switzerland. He set to starting with accotamine. Hofmann had plenty of lysergic acid to work with. He tried to add a different amide, a nitrogen varying molecule, back onto making a series of lysergic acid amides. One day, April the 16th, 1943, during the war, he was riding home on his bicycle and he started to feel really weird, started hallucinating, ataxic, and he realised it was as a result of what he had been making that day, and it was the diethyl that was the stage he had got to. So, 1954, LSD was legal. John Lilly, who's written this book, The Centre of the Cyclone, embarked on numerous experiments. He discovered transcendental experiences through tank work, which is being isolated in a tank of water, floating tank. repetition of sound, working with dolphins, and the use of LSD. Quite an interesting recipe he's got going there. For some bizarre reason, in 1973, I, as a teenager, read Lilly's Centre of the Cyclone. I always thought I still had the book, but I lost it. So I got it, I reordered it, got it back a week ago. Rereading it, as I did last week, I was completely baffled by the book. I don't know how I ingested it as a 17-year-old, but now, 50 years later, what's that? I recalled it as a significant text concerning LSD, and it was with some amazement that I discovered this year that Carl Rogers had referenced Lilly a number of times. Fortunately, Carl's responded eloquently to Lilly's significance, meaning my confusion could be crystallized by Carl's writing in 1980. Carl celebrates Lilly's research as giving concrete scientific evidence for the existence of different realities and the necessity for humans to be fulfilled to engage in meaningful dialogue, live in the moment, and strive for peaceful coexistence. I'm going to read a quote from Carl here. I think of John Lilly, 1973, a scientist trained at the California Institute of Technology, who went on to study neuroanatomy, medicine, and psychiatry, and who is perhaps best known for his 12 years of work with dolphins, trying to communicate with these animals, who he believes are at least as intelligent as human beings. To trace his path from his beginnings as a scientist who believed only in mechanical models of reality, to his present view that there are various levels of altered consciousness which he has achieved and helped others to achieve, is mind-boggling. Along the way, he became convinced that the dolphins could read his thoughts. Lilly's experiences in a sensory deprivation tank, where he floated in warm water with absolutely minimal input of sight, sound, touch, or taste, were fascinating. He discovered that the inner world, without any external stimuli, was incredibly rich, sometimes frightening, often bizarre. In trying to understand this inner world, he experimented with LSD, with both illuminating and terrifying results. This led to meditation, unbidden thought transmission, and higher states of consciousness, in which he, like many before him, who were called mystics, experienced the universe as a unity based on love, quite a distance from his Caltech training, which is the California Institute of Technology. These and other accounts cannot simply be dismissed with contempt or ridicule. This is Carl still. The witnesses are too honest. Their experience is too real. All these accounts indicate that a vast and mysterious universe, perhaps an inner reality, or perhaps a spirit world, of which we are all unknowingly a part, seem to exist. Such a universe delivers a final crushing blow to our comfortable belief that we all know what the real world is. I think that's an extraordinary quote, really. And those people who are studying Carl will know that his research was very, very carefully carried out, that he used himself and his clients as his research material. And I think the respect that he felt for John Lilly was very much founded on the fact that Lilly did all of this experimentation on himself. He didn't use other people. Obviously, he used dolphins, and at one point he's regretted that he actually did do some pretty horrible research on dolphins. But I think the respect that Carl felt was real. And some of you will know that Carl was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. he was aware that there was a prize being awarded, and he thought it should go to John Lilly, which shows how important he thought this proof and this evidence was, which I find really exciting. So Lilly, through his research, had given credibility to mystics and mysticism, to visionaries, to meditators, to shamans and shamanic practices. In 1963, LSD was made illegal by the USA. All the legitimate research, mainly carried out by scientists from different schools of practice, came to a dead end, halt. Some believe this was because it was getting hard to recruit soldiers to fight the war in Vietnam. Once someone took LSD, war made no sense. Carl was approached to start working with Vietnam veterans. This is when he began to realise the effectiveness of group work. And it was amplified whilst he was in a place called Esalen in Big Sur, California. I want to continue to bring in some other aspects of the scene that was emerging in the USA at the time, hence this slide. A man called Kenneth Rexroth was a respected poet and thinker in the 1950s. What's very interesting is that it seems after a visit by Dylan Thomas to California, he had read out some of his work. And before then, obviously in the distant past, poets were everywhere and spouting their work. And since the sort of Industrial Revolution and everything, this had all stopped. It was the print, everything was in print. Having seen Dylan Thomas and been affected by his words, Rexroth thought, right, I'm going to bring some poets together and we're going to have a reading. And that was it. That was the first reading advertised. As you can see, it says, a remarkable collection of angels on one stage, reading their poetry. No charge, small collection for wine and postcards. Charming event. So these poetry readings provoked the shared experience, consciousness raising through the spoken word. I'm just going to read a little extract of Ginsberg. This isn't his poetry, this is something he wrote as a foreword to Timothy Leary's book called Jail Notes. So it's his foreword. I'll try and get through it. It's Ginsberg work. It's crazy. Neil Cassidy drove Jack Kerouac to Mexico in a prophetic automobile to see the physical body of America, the same Denver Cassidy that 1 decade later drove Ken Kesey's Cosmos-patterned school bus on a Kafka circus tour over the roads of the awakening nation. And that awakening began, some say, with the first saxophone cry of the new mode of black music which shook the walls of white city mind, when Charles Parker lifted his bird-flighted note horn and announced a new rhythm of thinking, an extended breathing of the body in music and speech, a new consciousness, for as Plato had said, when the mode of the music changes, the walls of the city shake. Another person who was very much a user of LSD was a man called Alan Watts. He wrote a book called The Joyous Cosmology in 1962, and he declared the only danger of LSD was to authoritarian governments. He also said, when you've got the message, hang up the phone. He wasn't saying people need to take LSD all the time. It was, you've got this opportunity to open yourself up. Once you know it, that's enough. It doesn't leave you. couple of weeks, around Christmas, my son bought me this book, Did It? From Yippee to Yuppie, Jerry Rubin. Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were known activists in California, in Chicago. They did an awful lot of work and encouraged the demonstrations against Vietnam War and various other matters that were going on in the 60s. In that book, I was very excited because this was all about Jerry Rubin. It's not about psychotherapy, it's not about counselling or anything. But in there he's talking about Esalen, the institute that was established in 1962. And it says here, the Esalen Institute was founded in 1962, dubbed a Cape Canaveral of inner space. Esalen began as a laboratory for new thought, from Timothy Leary's Psychedelics to Carl Rogers' humanistic psychology to Joan Baez's folk music. So there we have Carl in the middle, in between Psychedelics and Joan Baez. Perfect. So Carl actually went to Esalen. He ran encounters in Esalen. This is a photograph of him in Esalen at a group encounter. It's in Howard Kirschenbaum's amazing book, The Life and Works of Carl Rogers. The encounters at Esalen gave evidence to Carl Rogers about the development of personal power when working in groups. And that resulted in the resistance of rules for rules' sake, resist social and political impediments to reaching potential, resist external attempts to control the individual. Rogers said, I have often said that if a dictatorship took over in this country, one of their first acts, if they were at all intelligent, would be to jail me and others who hold a person-centred point of view. These are images and covers from a quarterly which was started in 1957 called the Evergreen Review. Back then, obviously, there wasn't the internet. Telly was a bit minimal. People shared their thoughts and stories and their activism through journals such as this. And this went on until 1973, this particular journal. Here's images of the kinds of things that were going on in California and across America. And sadly, it seems they're potentially being echoed now in America. These are the kinds of books and the sort of music that was being shared at the time. As you can see, an absolute extraordinary kaleidoscope of thoughts, writings, poets, revolutionaries. There were quarterly magazines, such as The Ecologist. People were exploring new ideas and talking about the things that mattered to them, that they felt would bring about a peaceful society and one that looked after the planet. So, what about the UK? What was going on? Keele is what was going on. Professor Brian Thorne was a counsellor and a tutor in the School of Education at Keele University between 1968 and 1973. This was a period when LSD was already prevalent, and as Brian noted, it was in the hands of some doctors. This section is taken from a book I've self-published where Brian I recorded an interview with Brian. I wanted to talk to him about Keele. Brian, interestingly enough, one of the chaplains of that time at Keele University had been under the care of Dr. Frank Lake, a psychiatrist. Frank Lake was one of the very first psychiatrists in this country to have experimented with LSD. What was interesting was that Frank Lake saw no incompatibility between his own perception of spiritual reality and the potential of LSD to be a therapeutic tool within a healing process. The whole culture of Keele was a very extraordinary culture. When I first stepped into it in 1968, the place was in uproar. Many people felt Keele University was a pivotal area for the psychedelic culture in the universities. The surrounding culture, in a kind of global fashion, was full of questioning, rebelliousness, revolt, experimentation. There were lots of protests, a lot of marching, a lot of processions around the campus. On one occasion, they decided to do this naked. Quite a number of students had come through the trade union colleges, such as Colleague Harlech and so on. Second chance people who were very impassioned and from very strong union and working class backgrounds, deeply thirsty for knowledge, but also very intent on changing society, changing it from a very structured, somewhat hierarchical society to one which was going to be more open, be more egalitarian, and really care about the education for the entire population rather than for the elite. The Whole Earth Catalogue was a UK publication, and we also had something called Alternative in England and Wales, and this was a whole book that showed people how to break in, how to make a squat, how to break into places, how to connect electricity, how to do plumbing, setting up free schools, all sorts. It's a massive catalogue of information, and this was published by a man called Nicholas Sanders. This picture in the background here is the Global Village Trucking Company, which were based in East Anglia, and they set up a commune, and that's a picture of their house with everybody together. Right, this is Brian Thorne and this is Christine Bott. I'm just going to move back. Maybe I'm not going to move back. It's interesting. Not to worry. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's government managed to concrete over the delicate processes that were emerging from the revolutions of the 60s and 70s by cutting the funding of hundreds of projects that ran across the country. When she came into power, she tore the heart away from the delicate process of liberation. Many did not survive the shock of that loss. New ways of cooperating and of being creative had begun to emerge. People had started to reclaim their personal power, and in a space of what seemed like a few weeks, people could no longer pay their staff, pay the rent on the premises they operated from. Dreams were shattered, livelihoods ended. All that remained intact for notions, for instance, of feminism to survive, were diverted into issues of wealth and sex. What is split off and repressed, this is Anne Baring again, can take on a driving, persecuting, even demonic character. Perhaps that is the root of the increasing addictions to drug and sex in this society. The obsession with wealth and power, and the ever more malignant aggression of our weapons. So Christine Bott, was my colleague at the University of East Anglia. We met there in 1995 when we were both trained to be psychotherapists under the guidance of Brian and Judy Moore. Christine and her lover, a brilliant chemist, Richard Kemp, were behind the largest global manufacturing of the purest LSD ever made. They were arrested for conspiracy to flood the world with LSD by a police operation called Operation Julie, which was infamous in the 1970s, and people still remember it today. In 2007, Christine gifted me her memoirs, hoping she could find a way of telling her story, as cancer was ravaging her body and her dream of making her story known after decades of silence was slipping away. I was her death partner, and finally, having tried for years to find a publisher, took a leap of faith and self-published the story. Although many of Christine's contemporaries are now in their 80th decade, the mystery of what had happened to Christine and Richard had been a puzzle since 1978 when they were imprisoned. For them, the arrival of this book was as exciting as no one had heard anything of either Christine or Richard for 45 years. Christine was willing to risk her future, her life, in order to try and help make the world a better place. The forces that were prevalent at the time really didn't want to change the trajectory. They didn't want to stop drilling for oil. They didn't want to stop putting DDT on all of the crops. They just wanted to make money and industrialise the world, the very thing ancient tribes, and more contemporarily William Blake, were desperate about. Christine was driven by her literal experience of taking LSD, and as a scientist and a doctor, she suddenly considered that the systems and processes that she was learning about in terms of the human body were related to the earth and the planet and to plants, that these processes were not detached or different, that they were all similar in terms of checks and balances and how you maintain good health. And I think that really had an enormous impact on her. This is a quote from her autobiography. I believed that the process of industrialization, culminating in the discovery and release of atomic energy, was an opening up of knowledge that was beyond our moral and spiritual level of development to control. With the right preparation, mindset, setting and guide, an LSD trip could carry an individual into a brief experience of cosmic at-oneness, such had previously occurred spontaneously to a very few, was the goal of mystics of all faith and of people who had maintained the knowledge and use of their Aboriginal rituals and sacred plants. Both Christine and her partner, Richard Kemp, were aware of, a report that came out in the 60s, which was issued by the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome is a group of academics which still exist. And it was about the trajectory that we were set on as a race in terms of taking away from the planet more than we were putting back. And it was really alarming to them, and it was very much to do with the environment. Richard and Christine's decision to get involved in making LSD was driven by ecological concerns. That's Richard. That's Richard 3 years ago. The Club of Rome report, which drew attention and introduced the word ecology into the English language. Nobody had heard of ecology. The only people who talked about ecology were biologists, botanists and zoologists. So this is 1968. They understood a little bit about ecology, but it was a subset of biology, which was something if you went down the park and started talking about ecology, nobody would know what you bloody well meant. I'd still say about 90% of the population of the world don't know what ecology is. It was a report that said the Earth's resources are finite and have been used up, And once they're used up, they're gone. We're talking about fuel, we're talking about water, we're talking about the problems we're creating. Not only are we stripping the oceans of their food content in an unsustainable way, we are changing the ecology of the planet in a way that means we will be able to feed fewer and fewer people at the same time that the population is continuing to grow. And everything we're doing is having the opposite effect to what we should be doing. So we're going to hell, and nobody cares about it because they all think short term. All the business cares about is at the end of, when it comes to the end of the financial year, there's a profit and the shareholders get a dividend. So this is an interview I recorded with Richard in 2022. Christine seemed to be engaged with a process of complete belief that when what they did by producing this LSD, and they were providing it to 80% of the world from a little cottage in Wales, absolutely crazy, that it could be understood. I don't think she ever considered it to be criminal. She felt that it was an earnest attempt to change the course of human history. And this was echoed in how she presented herself in court. What did Brian Thorne think? Because Brian obviously trained Christine and me at the same time. He accepted her onto the course. And his reflection on it was, I suppose if any person has a passionate yearning for change in the interest of, if you like, the common good, then they will have achieved something. Which I thought was a nice thing to say. As a teenager, I naively believed the rest of the world to be safe. I ran away into peril. I finally collapsed into a state of visions and voices after enduring multiple traumatic events. My hand showed the signs of what is called stigmata. I believed I was the Virgin Mary reincarnated and that I was pregnant by Immaculate Conception. Of course I did. What else would I do? Good Catholic girl. I gained comfort when the clouds became ancient faces who spoke to me and reassured me. I suppose it was my first Julian and also Native American moment, as those voices all said the same thing, all will be well. The faces were of warriors with feathers or beads or tribal marks, and sometimes they were male Indian faces, female African faces. I was being spoken to by the ancients, who were sending me love and power in order to not die. I could access those moments when I was outside in nature, and much of the anxiety my behaviour caused was when I would run outdoors to be with the air and the sky. My life was in danger, psychiatrists told my parents, and that the only way they could treat me was to electrify my brain. And I was sectioned to an asylum, Worley Hospital, where I was left for 9 months. That experience added to the whole terror, and not yet 18 years old, I was living in a waking nightmare. Christine and I were both drawn to the work of Carl Rogers. We both understood and valued the impact of LSD. Would she think LSD was something to be used in treatment? She was horrified when she encountered a psychiatrist experimenting on a patient with it in the 60s. I suspect she'd be very wary. She was also regretful about not having considered the impact the caper had on some. She said, I was far removed from the street reality that was the destination of most of our acid, and I did not want to know or look too closely at the possibility that flooding the unprepared nervous system with such an overwhelming blast of energy could leave individuals in a permanently burnt-out condition. So far since self-publishing Christine's books, the messages I have received have been messages of gratitude. People who believe their lives were immediately transformed by using Richard's LSD and remained forever grateful. Richard's LSD, which is no longer available, or if it is, it's buried either in the Welsh foothills or deep in forest in East Anglia in Switzerland, was a powerful and impactful substance. It's to be treated with utmost caution and respect. I, once I'd self-published the story, was contacted by the BBC, who had come across the untold story of Christine Bott, and a radio podcast called Acid Dream was commissioned. And it is now 2 years on, in the process of being commissioned as a TV drama. So this is the website for the book. Only I sell it, nobody else sells it. This is the website for the BBC podcast Acid Dream, which is still available on Sounds. This is an interview I did on a brilliant podcast called The Bureau of Lost Culture, which is still available to listen to. And I was also interviewed on David Nutt's podcast called Drug Science Podcast, and that's still available. So I've been a bit busy since leaving Nottingham. Right, so how to conclude this tale, which reaches back to ancient civilizations, emerges into an explosive counterculture in the 1960s and 70s, only to be shut down in a matter of less than a decade. But the genie was out of the bottle, and the discoveries made by Lilly, the psychological impact of opening up, were central to the work and research of Carl Rogers. And over a few decades, his large group work continued across the world and continues to have its impact now. Nevertheless, even now, person-centred, client-centred approaches are harder and harder to practice. Courses offering experiential learning are lessening. And I did some research when I was gainfully employed, charting the decline. And I just happened to have oodles of BACP. It started off as BAC and then became BACP journals. And as you can see, from 1997 to 2017, it was the thing in the 90s, and it's declined down to being very small. There's a slight resurgence because of PCE, CFD, so getting it into the NHS has helped its presence. The other issue is about how many university courses are working in a person-centred way, and these trainings have, as you can see, have gone down as well. So, as ever, the approach is, perhaps rightly so, a countercultural endeavour, because this is all about the counterculture, really. All of this has been about the counterculture. Person-centred approaches to education have also been suppressed and have been languishing in the minds of those who are now dying. Is there a parallel here? What was done to LSD in its revolutionary zeal is and has been done to the person-centred approach. Person-centred approach incorporated, diluted, controlled, managed by BACP and scoped, and those seeking to register, regulate and license the practice. LSD and psychedelics, now manufactured by a few licensed laboratories and in the hands of good-hearted practitioners who see it as a therapy for problematic individuals struggling with conditions. Maybe society itself is the patient on the table. Societies are in the hands of the excessive obsessions of the wealthy and powerful, often driven by the need for stuff and things with extreme sexual practices. and to those who wish to control others, wielding wars, laying waste the planet, or seeking to escape to Mars, pursuing power, whilst many seek a society which yearns for peace, love and understanding. Sound familiar? What would Carl say? Now, there's a few people around who knew Carl Rogers, still alive, so I sent emails out to a few people, and one of them was Howard Kirschenbaum, and I was absolutely stoked when he replied. And Howard wrote, Carl Rogers, life and work of Carl Rogers. So I reintroduced myself to him, jogged his memory of how he might have seen me once, and I got a reply. My guess is that if Carl were alive today, he would not take psychedelics himself. He'd say he doesn't feel the need or desire or that he's too set in his ways to get into that whole new area. He'd feel supportive for those who want to explore psychedelics and hopes they do it in a responsible way. It's not an either-or. From what he's read and heard, psychedelics can be useful for expanding consciousness and for therapeutic healing. He's glad that there seem to be institutions that are studying the use of psychedelics in a scientific way, and he'll be interested to see what they learn. That's the end of my talk.